Thank you for joining us all on California Falconer's second podcast. Today with us, we've got Tim Gallagher. We're going to talk a little bit about his falconry, a little bit about his books, and a little bit about some of the projects he does that are sort of falconry adjacent. So Tim, what I like to do first is talk a little bit about falconers' origin stories. A lot of people probably know you a little bit, but I'd like to hear from you what you feel got you into falconry.
Well, I always liked birds. And even when I was a kid in England, I can remember going in my grandmother's backyard and trying to talk to birds and everything when I was like a toddler. and then when I was 6 years old, my parents got me a young parakeet and I trained it and everything. And it was great. And then growing, and we moved to Canada. And then, when I'd find sparrows that fell out of their nests, I'd raise them, house sparrows, things like that. And so I was kind of moving my way along the chain of birds. And then I got into pigeons, and that was really great. My friends and I would, we'd switch our pigeons so they'd home back to each other so we could send messages to each other. So I kind of thought that was like the ultimate. This one I was about 9 or 10 years old, but then I discovered falconry. And actually, I think I first heard of it, there was that Disney movie, Rusty and the Falcon. And that was probably about 1958 or something like that. And I think that got a few people interested because I've talked to other people over the years. And that sort of is when I first heard of it. But it still was probably 2 or 3 years before I actually started getting birds and training them. But yeah, I started doing it when, not that long after we moved to the United States, and it was Kennedy was president. So it was a long time ago, and I started flying these Kestrels, and I got into game hawking with them pretty much right away. Took a lot of sparrows with this male I had, and I released them at the end of the summer, and I'd had one before that too, which she actually caught a few other kestrels. She was very aggressive to other kestrels. I didn't count them as game. I just rescued them and let them go. But it took about 5 kestrels with her, and then I had another female that took a bunch of, which I flew from a waiting on position. The male I flew almost like a Cooper sock, and I was in there was a rhubarb patch which grow in rows, and he'd drop off my fists and do these long sneak attacks, like longer than the length of a football field. They're really long, sneaking up just ground level, and then suddenly all these birds would explode, and he'd swoop up and grab one, and he caught a blackbird doing that one day, which was really great. So, and I had a Swainson's hawk someone gave me that was really kind of a battered old thing and really wild, and I managed to tame that bird down. And not a great hunter, of course. They're kind of mousers, but it was good training for me.
Definitely.
And then I started flying red tails, and I had a really good red tail that took a bunch of jackrabbits. And I released her too. I used to be really into releasing birds when I was a kid. I thought, oh, these birds need to be wild, and I'm totally not there anymore. Now I think, these birds have it so good in falconry. They never go hungry. They got a guardian angel looking over them, and if they you're monitoring their health, you're keeping them away from danger as much as possible, and taking them to the veterinarian if they need it. And I think of these poor wild birds, and of course they get better from year to year. Of course, especially something like a peregrine. They're not even getting into their full potential until they're about 3 years old or so. I don't know. So I keep birds now if I bring them in.
Definitely. Do you do wild caught anymore, or do you stick with captive?
Well, in New York State, you can only legally train captive bred birds. I mean, it's very restrictive. It's even like ones that were from bloodlines that were taken in by, I think, 1972 from the wild. And like I recently rehabbed the peregrine, and it wasn't something I could transfer to my falconry license at the end because it was a wild bird. And I can't get a legal wild peregrine from Texas or even like New Jersey. You can catch them legally, and I couldn't take one, bring it back to New York. So, because I'd love to fly another tundra. I think they're sort of the perfect bird in a lot of ways, especially since now we've got telemetry and GPS and all that, which make it a lot easier. When I was first flying tundras, there was nothing. You just had to hope for the best, and
Yeah, and tundras are known for their peregrination, right?
Yeah. It's funny. They're very tame and easy to train and great flyers, but if they go over the hill, you might not get them back.
Yeah. So you started falconry kind of before a lot of the regulations were in place. Is that right?
Yeah, except even in the early '60s, they were paying like $15 a year for a license, and you had to be at least 16 and things like that. And yeah, there wasn't any apprenticeship thing or being a master or a general. You got a permit, and there was no test or anything like that. But I remember actually my first license. I don't know how old I was, probably 13 or something, and someone had called the fish and game department and said I had this bird, and a game warden came out, and he said, "Well, it looks like you're taking really good care of it. You just need to get a license." I said, "Yeah, well, I'm 13. Is that okay?" He said, "No." I said, "Maybe one of your parents can get one." So I got one in my mother's name. So for the first 2 or 3 years of falconry, I was Daphne Gallagher. I'd carry that out in the field.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like falconry has changed a lot since you started. What changes have you noticed, or do you think are really big in falconry?
Yeah, it's a tough question in some ways. I think the quality of hawking's actually gotten really, really good in America. Probably more so than it used to be. I think there were some of us back then that were really avid game hawkers, and we wanted to have our birds fly at a high pitch and all that. But I mean, some of the things that, well, of course, captive breeding made it to where it was no problem to get various birds, peregrines, Gyrfalcons, and even hybrids. I mean, that wasn't something you could do. And some of those are like super hawks, Gyr peregrine or something. They're pretty fabulous birds. I've always tended to fly birds that are not hybrids because I'm besides wanting to fly bird, I'm interested in the behavior of a peregrine or a prairie falcon, or something. So I usually have purebred birds. But there's that, and also telemetry opened up some kinds of hawking that were difficult before, like things like sage grouse and things like that, where a bird might knock a sage grouse down, stun it, and then chase it for 5 miles out in the distance, and you'd lose your bird or get attacked by something else. Well, now, of course, you can just follow them to the kill. And that kind of revolutionized a lot of kinds of hawking.
Yeah,
and I think you're going to see changes now with GPS. I mean, people are doing interesting things. They're realizing what their birds are actually doing. I mean, that your bird might be 7 miles away and do some really interesting approach to the game, and you weren't aware of that before. You only knew when they came by and you saw them, and I find that really fascinating. Interesting thing. that tiercel I had for years, Macduff, I used to go out flying, sometimes not too far from the lab of ornithology where I worked, because, I'd go scouting duck ponds in the morning early and then go to work. And a couple hours later, I might go out and fly, and then I'd take him home at lunchtime. But, sometimes people would go flying with me, and he'd just he'd go up really high and then just disappear a lot of times. And people, oh, aren't you going to get in your car and start searching, and all that? And I said, no, he's just doing the peregrine thing. And 15 minutes later, he'd come by really high and go flush the ducks, get a great flight and all that. And, interestingly, a couple of years ago, I was flying this female peregrine, and she did something just like that, but I had GPS. And I'm suddenly looking, and God, she's 7 miles away and she's still going the other way. So I jump in my car and did other side of hills and all that kind of stuff. And I drive all the way over there, and it took me 15, 20 minutes to get to where I'd last seen her on the thing. And then I look at the thing, and it says she's back in that field where I was flying, and she's 1,700 feet high, circling around where I should have been. So it just goes to show you, if I had just treated her like Macduff, it would have been no problem,
Yeah. GPS is really interesting, I think, because you can now see what your birds are doing, in detail. You can see their pitch, you can see their exact location.
You can see everything.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've found interesting is that it seems like falconers can't be as creative with their stories of the field if they have GPS on recording it. Because now you have actual evidence of how high the bird was, so you can't just say 1,000 feet.
1,000. Well, interestingly enough, I guess I was always conservative about it, because I'd say, oh, the bird's up 500-600 feet, And now when I see what I used to call that pitch, the bird might be up 1,100 feet, 1,200 feet.
Wow.
So I was conservative about it. I wasn't, lying that way. So
going the other direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a pleasant surprise for you, I guess.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about your books. I think a lot of falconers are probably familiar with your work, Falcon Fever, but you've done a lot of adjacent work like The Grail Bird, Imperial Dreams, and then some stuff in angling and some other subjects. So can you talk about a little bit about your literature and what that means to you, or what type of influence your falconry has had on that?
Well, of course, one of my first sort of narrative nonfiction books was Parts Unknown. It was actually a collection of essays and articles I'd done over the years. And a lot of that is really related to, my falconry experience, because I was doing stuff like doing Gyrfalcon research in Greenland and Iceland and other places. And so that heavily influenced it. And as far as, I got interested in the ivory-billed woodpecker. I was for years. It was kind of an interesting bird, and it was big and beautiful. So it had the same kind of allure to me as like a peregrine or something in a way. And just the mystery behind it and the human connection. I'm interested in the human history of things like falconry. I mean, it makes it much richer for me that people were doing falconry 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, and that it was really big 1,000 years ago, and that just makes it much more rich for me than it might be if this was something we just invented in our generation.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I got into the ivory-bill thing, and I didn't know at the time if the birds were extinct or not. A lot of people thought they became extinct in the mid 1940s, but that wasn't a new thing. I mean, people thought in the early 20th century they were extinct, and then Arthur Allen, who founded the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, he found a nest in 1924 in Florida. And it was like a big newspaper story that, hey, these birds aren't extinct, And it's some taxidermists read about it in the paper and went out and shot the birds. So it's kind of awful. And then he found some again in 1935 where they actually took movies and sound recordings and did a lot of the stuff he had wanted to do in 1924. I mean, he had all that equipment. He thought, well, I don't want to spook these birds. I want to, he thought he'd leave them alone for a couple of weeks until maybe their young hatched and all that. And they ended up getting killed. So, but anyway, all that stuff I found really interesting. And then I thought, well, if these birds actually are extinct, like the living people who are still around or might be our last connection with them. And I started tracking these people down and doing interviews. And some of them were quite old, like Richard Poe, who was the guy who he found out about what was going on at Hawk Mountain in the early 1930s. And he took all those pictures that you see of the dead hawks piled up. And he went around and gave talks all over New York City and places like that. Got wealthy people involved. And this one woman, Rosalie Edge, she bought that whole ridge that people were shooting on and made it into a sanctuary. So that was an interesting connection. But anyway, he had seen the birds in 1944. I don't know how much of the story you know, but there was the Singer Tract, 81,000 acres of virgin timber, and it was being clear cut. And he found this bird in 1944, and that was the last one anyone saw for years. And he actually went on to be the first president of the Nature Conservancy. And because of what happened with the ivory bill, they couldn't stop that Singer Tract from being cut. President Roosevelt and the governors of 4 states wanted to save that land, and they appealed to the guy who was running the Chicago Mill and Lumber Company that had the cutting rights. And he actually said, well, we're just money grubbers and we don't care about what you want. We're going to cut those trees. And they did. And there's nothing they could do. So Richard Poe decided to, get some wealthy people again and buy land from them. That was what the Nature Conservancy became. Something you can't, when something's threatened habitat-wise, you can't wait for the government to do something about it. You've got to buy that land and then prevent that from happening. And it was the ivory bill that inspired that. But anyway, my wife and I went and spent 4 days with him where he lived in Martha's Vineyard, and he was 99 years old. And it was so fascinating. He liked the fact that I was a falconer. Thought that was it because he loved birds of prey. And so anyway, people like that, I was interviewing people. And then I started finding people who claimed to have more recent sightings or even just descriptions. And there were people like hunters who, like a deer hunter sitting for hours in a deer stand, or a turkey hunter all camoed up and having perfect descriptions of these birds. And, a hunter can really give a good description of something because they've had the experience of seeing something and shooting it and seeing it in their hand. And some of these guys seemed really believable. I started checking up on things like that. And it was really funny. I'd talk to someone and they say, oh yeah, they tell me about a sighting they had, but old so-and-so had this really good sighting and blah, blah, blah. And, but he moved away. He moved to Texas or something. And so they'd give me a name, and I just do these searches all over the country for these people. And I'd have a list, 20 or 30 names. I was like a salesman doing cold calls. I'd call up and say, this is Tim Gallagher from Cornell University, and I'd like to talk to you about that ivory-billed woodpecker you saw in 1956. And most times I go, what the hell? And I go, sorry, wrong number. Move on to the next person. But so I started checking up on these, and sometimes the land had been ruined, and other times it looked good. And we do searches. I had a good friend, Bobby Harrison from Alabama. We went all over the place searching, and then we finally got wind of this guy, Gene Sparling, who had a sighting like 4 days earlier that sounded really good. And so we went right down there, and we were going to spend a week floating the bayou, eastern Arkansas, where this bird was seen. And we actually had a sighting. So that was incredible. And that's what started that whole thing. I went back to Cornell and told the director of the lab I'd seen an Ivory-bill. And he was like, what around here? Because he didn't know I'd been gone. Like, I was waiting outside his office when he came in, and I'd flown home all night, got stuck in an airport and things. And I looked terrible. I couldn't sleep all night. I was worried. And he said he was afraid I was going to tell him I had an incurable disease or something. Anyway, yeah, that's how the grill bird, that turned out well. That was a bestseller back when it came out in 2005. And that's really how I got the contract to write Falcon Fever for Houghton Mifflin, because that book had done so well. So, and then Imperial Dreams later I did for Simon & Schuster. And that was, the closest relative of an Ivory-bill woodpecker is the imperial woodpecker of Mexico, but it's much bigger. It's a huge bird. It's like the size of a raven. And they hadn't really been seen since the mid-1950s. And so we just started searching in the mountains, Sierra Madre Occidental, and had some pretty scary, it's in the drug country, and there's a lot of mean people with AK-47s. So.
Wow.
But
did you ever have any encounters where you came across them and told them that you were looking for a bird?
Yeah, even we'd made contact with this guy who was a forester who who did a lot of work up in that area, and he knew some guys who actually turned out to be drug lords, but they were kind of kinder, gentler drug people. He got them to come down and meet us in Durango, and we did our whole spiel. We showed this movie we had that was taken in 1956, and it was that's the only photographic evidence of a living imperial woodpecker. So so we showed him the movie, and I found a survivor from that expedition way back then, a younger guy who'd gone along with these other people, and he told me there was this big rock outcropping, and he said, if you can find that rock outcropping, it's very close to where we saw those woodpeckers, and filmed it. And so the big outcropping. And we show this to these guys. They come into the guy's office in Durango. I go, oh, sí, los pilares, the pillars. They knew the exact spot. And, so Marchand Lamertink and I, went on Google Earth, and we found some mesas that were completely uncut,
Uh-huh.
And so that's what we wanted to check out. But meanwhile, a wave of violence came sweeping through there. And like the night before we left to go out there was a big explosion down the street. And it turned out some people had shot a rocket-propelled grenade at the hotel just down from ours, where some federales were staying.
Whoa.
It was just like all hell was breaking loose there. And then the forester got an anonymous call from someone threatening us, and seemed to know all about us being there and didn't want us there. And he said he thought we should not go. And we went out in the park to meet him and Cornelio, who was really the main drug lord from that group. And it was like, well, maybe you should put it off till later. And Marchand said, what do you think, Tim? Should we do this? And I just said, well, every time I put, there have been many times in the last couple of years then where someone would say, "Oh, it's really bad. Wait till next year, maybe better." And it was always like 10 times worse. It was never any better. And so finally, so he asked me, and I said, "Well, I just feel like if I don't go now, not only am I not gonna in my lifetime see something, no one else is gonna go here. We're here. We're a 5-hour drive on a really terrible mud road up to the mountains from those areas where there's uncut timber, and there's a real chance if there's any left, they might be there." And but meanwhile, all these Mexican researchers who were with us are just saying, "Well, I can't go. I don't want to do that." And one guy, I even had a Sinaloa accent, and they hate people from Sinaloa and that part of the Sierra.
Wow.
So yeah, so they all dropped out except for two guys. There was one guy was like 21 years old, and the other guy was 16. I didn't even know he was that young at the time. He was driving the truck that Pro Natura Noreste had supplied us. So we were going to go up there, and then the drug lord Cornelio and his people were going, and so we were a caravan of 3, and they were in the front, we were in the middle, and Marchand and the Julian, the forester, were behind us. And so we're going up there, and we're partway up there, and suddenly a truck comes blazing past, and it was one of these, club cab pickup, actually like what Cornelio had, but as guys had AK-47s and everything, and they just go racing past us, and they go next to Cornelio's car, and they're talking to him through the window, and then they finally peel off and go away. And later, when we were going through what we knew was hostile territory to get to the area where they, and Cornelio was a Tepehuane, indigenous people. They all were up there. And when we finally got to his territory, he was just all white as a sheet and freaked out. And they threatened him, and they fit the description of some people who'd murdered some people in another village a couple of weeks earlier.
Wow.
And so that put a whole different thing in it. And then when we got to his cabin, he got out an Uzi and loaded it up and put it under the seat. I'm kind of glad he didn't have it before that, because they might have gotten a little shootout, right? People in Mexico can't have guns, even like 22s or anything like that.
Right.
They'll take your car away and throw you in jail. So he hadn't been carrying it. So him putting that gun in his car was like a real escalation. And he said, we were going to stay there for a couple of weeks. And he told us, "Well, leave a day earlier than you're going to, and we'll meet you here at 10 a.m. And don't try to get out of here without it. We'll go in caravan again." But it just went to hell from there. Suddenly there were people coming around with guns, and we actually, during our hiking around, we even went past opium patches and marijuana, usually guarded by kids, who'd water it and kind of keep it. And but then right at the end, it just got really crazy, and we were supposed to go out that day, and of course no one showed up to meet us. And we found the village elder and talked to him, and he was just blasé about the whole thing. "Oh yeah, it's kind of bad down below, and 3 houses were burned, and he said something like, but you will get there at best," or something. Okay, what about at worst? So we started driving out of there, and a flatbed truck comes up the other way, and they stop by us, and the woman riding shotgun talks over the people to us, and there's all these Indians in the back, just completely freaked out in blankets and huddled and scared, and they're fleeing.
Wow.
She said, "Oh yes, it's very bad, but God may help you." And she crossed herself. And so at that point, I took like the memory cards out of my recorder, and out of my cameras, and I put them in my hip pocket, and I had my passport and a credit card, a few things like that because I thought there's such a good chance of something bad happening.
Yeah.
There were parts there you could only go 3 or 4 miles an hour. You could walk faster. The road was that bad, and it'd be so easy to have a little blockade and just, and if we're lucky, they just take all our stuff and would just be left on the road. And so I wanted to have a couple of things in my,
Yeah.
so that my trip wouldn't be wasted. Like a notebook, I'd been keeping notes in. And I thought at worst, if it went really bad, maybe my wife could finish the book I was working on. I don't know. And so it was scary. And even going on the way down, another car came by, and it's like we were as far away as we could be. And you look, and the other guy, they were just terrified, so they were just like us. There's some Mexicans who were just terrified. And finally, miraculously, we got down to the paved road, and we're just, before that, these kids had loved the Mexican music with the brass trumpets and all that, and hadn't put it. But we got to the road, and they just put the music in. We're all hooting and singing in Spanish, and going crazy, and it was so great. But we got down there, and Julian, the forester, he made arrangements to meet us the next morning in the park, and we were going to go have breakfast together or something. And I just never forget, he's coming up to us. He just looks so emotional, and he just grabbed us and hugged us tightly. And he said, the forestry department wouldn't let me have a truck. They wouldn't let me go. And then I heard that Cornelio wasn't gonna be able to be there. And he was just terrified for us, and he said, my wife and I, the night before, we got down on our knees and prayed to God for your deliverance, and we were all just crying in the park. And so it was pretty intense. Like he never would have forgiven us, so, because he had encouraged us at one point,
Wow. So did you have any inclination that, you're kind of starting off writing this mystery sort of ornithology book, looking for this bird that hasn't been seen? Did you have any inclination that you'd be launching yourself into an Indiana Jones-like adventure?
I don't know. I just always wanted to do things that were interesting, and I started doing kind of long form journalism, like going on. Well, like I never became an ornithologist myself, because I sort of always loved to read novels and poetry and other books, and really wonderful writing. And I really hate the technical writing that scientists do. It just completely turned me off, and I just couldn't see myself doing that. But I wanted to do the other stuff they did. And so I started going along on various kinds of expeditions or research trips and things, and being like a field assistant, but then writing about it, covering it in depth, and I wasn't ever a burden on the people. I more than carried my weight. I was a good field assistant, and so I got to go on all those things, like going all over Iceland, climbing the Gyrfalcon iris, and went to Greenland a couple of times, and northern Canada and South America and Africa, and just always writing about stuff. And once I had a couple of things published, people who I was approaching knew something about me, and they thought they'd like to have me go along and cover their work. And I was also a photographer, so I'd take good pictures of the people and the work they're doing. So I don't know how that exactly led into the scarier things, but all this stuff can be dangerous at some level. I mean, if you're climbing around on cliffs and going to these eyries.
definitely.
dangerous in itself. It's a little scary. I didn't like the kind of evil people who might murder you. That's like, I can stand the thought of falling off a cliff, or or having an accident, falling in
Right.
frozen water in Greenland. But that just seemed it'd be an awful way to go. So
Yeah. So I think what's interesting is there's not a lot of people who do the type of work that you do. Like, going on expeditions and writing more literature about it. But I think it's as or more important than the actual scientific writing that's going on around it. As California Falconers, we're a we're a volunteer organization, but one of our tenets is education. And I think the type of writing that you do actually has a major influence on new generations coming in who don't have a concept of what conservation is, that don't have any passion for nature. So I have to say, I think your work is really important, and if falconers haven't read it, I think they should, because even though it's not all falconry based, it's really all based around some conservation topics and just in general being in nature.
yeah, and I've tried to influence people not to be so negative about falconry too. Over the year, because I've given hundreds and hundreds of talks to various Audubon groups over around the country, and I always try to say something good about falconry. But that's kind of where I came from.
Yeah, and falconry and writing about these expeditions and stuff like that has some similarity to it. Like, at least for me, falconry is about getting out into nature and experiencing something that is much more natural than anything, any type of other hunting or anything else that I could really do.
Yeah, that's true.
So I'm really interested in your expeditions to the Gyrfalcons. Can you talk a little bit about that, what you were doing there?
Yeah, I had a really interesting time. The first time I really went out looking for Gyrfalcons was with Olafur Nielsen, who's an Icelandic ornithologist, and he had actually been a grad student at Cornell and studied under Tom Cade. So it was pretty easy for me to get in touch with him and get myself invited along. And it was a real rugged trip. So I was younger then, of course, and so I was very fit, but we were just like we went to really pretty radical places there. Even just having to climb up so high, really steep mountainsides to get to where you can rappel down to an eyrie was tough going. But man, it was exciting, and we saw so many birds. I think we banded 52 Gyrfalcons, and we couldn't get to all the eyries. Sometimes we just were able, if it was just totally inaccessible, we'd set up a scope and just try to count the number of young in the nest. But we did climb to enough to band 52. So that
Wow.
was very exciting. And it was just such a different world there. I don't know, the Icelandic people are fascinating. They really believe in elves and fairies and things like that. and it's kind of a magical quality to it. And they're aware of the whole history. That just it was founded by Vikings, and they had all their sagas and their Eddas, and but we'd hear about be careful climbing around that lake because a couple of people drowned there. And you find out later that it happened in 1500 AD, you know. They just remember all that stuff. And then I can remember there was this caldera of volcano that had a lake in it, and we were going to climb up to an eyrie in one side of it. And Oliver warned us about not kicking any rocks in there because, you know, some kids had done that hundreds of years ago and they got killed by this monster. And I say, well, do you believe in that? And he'd say, well, don't want to take any chances. He was great. And he tells us about this horse-like creature that had flippers. I think it was called Niker or something like that. That tried to lure people to ride on it like a siren call, you know, and then drown them. And, you know, so it was so amazing. And, you know, we'd hear about, oh, that's the cave where Grettir the Strong lived, you know, 800 years ago when he was hiding out. Yeah, so I love that. I mean, talk about human history. It's fascinating. And not to mention the birds, you know, these beautiful silver gray gyrs. And I went to Iceland a couple of times. And I went to Iris both times, but that first time was the one when we saw tons of birds and all. The other time I was leading a tour for Cornell Adult University. But, and then, and in Greenland, of course, I went there 2 years in a row. And that wasn't just to work with Gyrfalcons, but man, I saw the whitest ones I'd ever seen were all up there in northern Greenland. And we're also studying the food that they prey on, the dovekies. You know, we're trapping them in mist nets and banding them with Danish bands. And Bill Burnham and his son Kurt was on both those trips. And Bill Burnham was an amazing person. He was a great loss. He died in his late 50s, you know, like brain cancer, but he was an incredible guy. You could not even keep up with him. He was a dynamo. I remember he climbed up the top of this cliff he wanted to band some peregrines, and he tied a rope to a rock and rappel, and he wanted to do it. He wanted to be able to go to the nest really fast and not bother the birds very much. And I was with Jim Anderson. We were down below on a spit of land with a spotting scope, with radio contact to him, trying to tell him exactly where the nest is so he can get in and out quickly, because he couldn't see from up above. And he made 3 different rappels and had ascenders to get back up, but really, really fast and just amazing. And then finally got the birds and got out of there. And
wow.
He and I, you know, I don't know if you've seen my book, Parts Unknown. There's a picture of a white gyrfalcon. It's actually a recently fledged eyas. And made that possible, a little rubber raft around the base of the eyrie and tied. It was just the 2 of us. We didn't have ropes or any kind of climbing equipment. We started climbing up, and I had a really heavy Gitzo tripod and 500 millimeter lens and all this stuff. And we were climbing up, and finally we're just holding on clumps of tussock grass. And it's really almost sheer. I mean, it was just insane when I think back of it. And he finally says, well, you want me to carry your stuff or something? I paused about 10 seconds for, yeah, please. And he just went up there like a mountain goat, you know, and went about the last, 40, 50 yards up, and it was amazing. And then I just sat up there, and the sun, I remember the morning sun, it was like the bird, it was part dark and I had to wait until it just shifted, and I finally got the shots I was after. But then climbing down was 10 times harder than climbing up. I mean, and it's just like you'd go into the ocean, at least you wouldn't hit in the rocks, but I mean, it's below freezing. There's icebergs. So yeah, that was a scary moment, but I couldn't have done it without Bill for sure.
That's awesome. I think one of the things I enjoy so much about your writing is the human connection that you have to all of these stories. That's what makes it so compelling, is because you focus on what's going on with the people that surround all of these stories, basically. So
yeah, to me, it would be boring without it. Boring to read, but also boring to write.
absolutely. But we kind of see ourselves in a lot of the people that you write. So it kind of gives us that connection, deeper connection to what's going on than would otherwise be if you were writing procedural, this is what we did kind of.
Right.
So definitely. Well, let's shift gears a teeny bit. What does your falconry look like nowadays?
Well, I don't have a falconry bird right now, and I'm thinking I need to. It hasn't been as good around here the last 3 or 4 years. I don't know why. I mean, some of the ponds I had are filled in, and just some of them. It might be to do with climate change, but I used to kind of be dependent on it getting really cold kind of early up north to push the ducks down to us,
Mm-hmm.
And now it's not happening. Like there were ponds that would have 30 ducks toward the end of October, and they just don't have any, or they don't have many. And then when it finally does get really cold, it gets cold here too, and they're all frozen over. And it's just gotten so hard. I think I'm probably going to have to do something like go out west for a couple of months of the year. That's what people used to do who worked for the Peregrine Fund when they were all here.
Mm-hmm.
I probably did a lot more local hawking than most people ever did, but it was always really hard work. It wasn't. I got to say, when I lived back in California, back when there were more wide open spaces and like that, it was a lot better than here. I don't think it is now, but
yeah. So you've got to kind of really fight for your opportunities there.
Yeah, and not as many other kinds of birds to hunt. It's stuff like when I was in Southern California. You're waiting for the ducks to arrive or whatever, the various migrant birds, and they're coming there to winter. And here it's like, this is the winter place. And everything leaves. I mean, it's...
you kind of got a narrow window of when you can actually get out hawking locally.
Well, it was always tough. I would do stuff like it'd get down to where most of the ponds were frozen. And ducks seemed to be, I started out in the first season, I tried crow hawking and did some interesting things with that, but it was like really high flights. And luckily my peregrine really hated crows because he'd gotten harassed really badly when he was young one time when I flew him. So he'd do these great flights all over the sky, but almost every time they were really hard pressed, they would just drop into the canopy of the trees because the country's not open enough around here.
Right.
And, I took a couple, or actually only one brought to the bag. One got away when I was making in out in the stubble field, but so that was tough. But it's funny, the last time I flew him at crows, had a pretty good flight, and then he just rang right back up and he was feeling good. And I knew there was a pond in that field not too far away, and I just thought, see what happens. And I flushed some mallards and he killed the head mallard. Okay, so that's what I did finally. And it was unfortunate. At Kestrels, they're almost in the fall. There are almost always nothing but big ducks. Mallards, black ducks, and common mergansers, huge, so, but he went for everything. And occasionally I get an opportunity at something else, take a hooded merganser or a teal or some ring-necked ducks, but usually those were not on the small ponds in the fall. They'd come that way migrating north, but for some reason hardly ever in the fall. And the big water around here is just hopeless, these Finger Lakes.
Yeah, there's no way to flush from there.
No, they wouldn't go over land. I did do some things like with Oxbow Creeks and things like that. And there was one place I used to fly where the pond would freeze, but it was kind of spring fed, and there'd always be some water flowing in, and a little place where sometimes half a dozen ducks would be. And I can remember I would put chest waders on. I remember a few times like just running and jumping under the ice, breaking through, just to be so dramatic that it would flush them away, and taking them like that. But it really, by about mid-January or so, it was hopeless. But
yeah, that's a tough way to hunt, that's for sure. So
anyway, now for most of the hunting season, I don't even see any ducks on these ponds because of the timing of the migration of them, I think.
Wow. Yeah, well, we'd love to have you out to California to take an expedition.
Yeah, I should get out there. Both my sisters still live in California.
Excellent. Yeah, we California Falconers, we meet for dinners and stuff all the time. So if that,
I know, I'm always getting invitations from Chi.
Yeah. So we'd love to have you out to a dinner if it lines up with a falconry expedition or anytime you're in California. The last thing I wanted to talk about, because you're kind of into conservation and education a little bit, which are, like I said, two of the major tenets of California Falconers. But one thing that we're focusing on is what we can do better as a falconry community in terms of conservation. Do you have any thoughts on what we could do to better ourselves as falconers, like practically in conservation?
I'm kind of out of touch with things in California now. I mean, if you can help in research, perhaps, do field work with people who wouldn't be negative about falconry, but yeah. I mean, I don't know what's going on in places like Santa Cruz Predatory Bird Research Group. I mean, help groups like that. And even some rehab efforts. If you can make friends with some of the rehabbers who would actually be glad to give an injured peregrine or a prairie falcon to a falconer to work with. I do stuff like that now around here. And,
yeah, that's a great idea. Helping,
and various kinds of bird count things and things.
Yeah, that's a great idea, helping rehabbers, because we do have some knowledge and some skills that rehabbers don't tend to.
And I know some of them have a negative attitude toward it, but they really shouldn't. but some are quite supportive and are glad to have the help and glad to give birds to people at time, because it's much easier for them if they get, even if it becomes a falconry bird. I mean, it's good for everyone. They don't have to take a bird from the wild, and you're helping this injured one get back going. And,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of wraps up my time, but I wanted to encourage all California Falconers, if you haven't read any of Tim's work, start with Falcon Fever, because you'll resonate with that. But all of his other work is fantastic. And as a falconer, I can attest to the quality of the work. And Tim, I really appreciate your time talking to me today. It's been an honor to meet one of my falconry legends.
Well, thanks. I hope I'll get to meet you in person sometime. I get out to a meet or something.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time and have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. See ya.